大家好，欢迎大家收看中国简报。我们为您带来全球媒体关于中国时政、经济和社会的最新内容以及独家分析。我们可信、专业、多角度的中国报道，为世界精英提供判断、决策参考。中国简报使用多种语言发行，包括文字、视频、播客、书刊多种形式。同时，我们也在六度世界进行全天候播放。
欢迎收看本期中国简报。今天是2023年10月6日。在中国简报中，我们为您带来来自全球媒体的有关中国政治、经济和社会的最新新闻，以及独家专家分析。如果您发现我们的内容有帮助，请订阅我们的实时通讯。中国和越南为习近平下个月访问河内做准备，消息人士。路透社。据4位知情人士透露，中国国家主席习近平计划于10月底或11月初访问越南。这次访问是在美国总统乔·拜登9月访问越南后不久进行的。此次访问将凸显这个东南亚国家日益增长的战略重要性。官员们正在制定一份将在习近平访问期间发表的联合声明，并就命运共同体一词的纳入进行了讨论。习近平经常使用这一提法，但越南官员对此持谨慎态度。赖清德，台湾选举自己的领导人，因此已经独立。路透社。台湾1月份总统选举前的民意调查中领先的副总统赖清德表示，台湾已经是独立和主权的，没有必要单独宣布独立。赖清德发表此番言论之际，中国仍然将台湾视为其领土的一部分，并且并未放弃使用武力将台湾置于其控制之下。赖清德对台湾独立的立场招致了中国以及台湾主要反对党国民党的批评。赖清德强调，台湾人民必须决定自己的未来，即将到来的选举将在民主与独裁之间做出选择。台湾现任总统蔡英文因任期限制无法竞选连任。中国将把其空间站的规模扩大1倍，为美国宇航局领导的国际空间站提供替代方案。美国有线电视新闻网。中国计划在未来几年内将其空间站从3个模块扩大到6个，在美国宇航局领导的国际空间站接近其使用寿命之际，为其他国家的宇航员提供近地任务的替代平台。中国空间技术研究院表示，中国空间站的运行寿命将超过15年，比之前宣布的10年还要长。天宫已成为中国对其太空事业日益增长的影响力和信心的象征，也是美国在脱离国际空间站后在该领域的挑战者。欧盟领导人将在全球紧张局势中讨论经济安全。路透社。欧盟领导人将在格拉纳达举行的峰会上讨论如何增强欧盟竞争力，并减少对第三国，特别是中国的依赖。这次会议将有助于就欧盟委员会加强对具有潜在军事用途的技术的出口和流出的控制的提案进行讨论。欧盟执行委员会计划评估与先进半导体、人工智能、量子技术和生物技术相关的欧盟经济安全风险。辩论还将涉及国家安全政策的协调以及欧洲市场对外国公司的开放。黄金周期间，游客激增前往澳门、香港。路透社。中国黄金周假期期间，澳门和香港等中国控制地区的游客数量激增，但数量仍约为疫情前水平的 85% 左右。澳门接待游客约90万人次，每日人数较去年增加5倍多。中国大陆游客占澳门游客的 80%。假期期间，香港约有100万游客抵达，零售商报告称人流量增加了 30%。然而，销售情况与正常周末相似，表明一些游客不愿消费。与中国发生冲突后，马尼拉重新补给海港。英国广播公司。据英国广播公司报道，中国船只封锁了菲律宾补给船前往有争议的南中国海的一个前哨基地。该事件发生时，2艘菲律宾海岸警卫队船只和2艘商船试图抵达仁爱礁，迎接他们的是一艘比商船大5倍的中国海警船。这次会面持续了几个小时。菲律宾和中国之间的紧张局势依然高度紧张，因为两国都对南海拥有主权。马尼拉每月都会向其位于仁爱礁的前哨基地提供补给，以加强其对该水域的经济权利。国际货币基金组织、世界银行会面，新兴经济体面临中国和利率压力。路透社。新兴市场面临多重挑战，包括近期美国国债遭到抛售、中国经济放缓以及美联储加息的不确定性。 在即将在马拉喀什举行的世界银行和国际货币基金组织的年会上，政策制定者和资产管理者将重点关注违约国家的重组努力、中国经济放缓、乌克兰融资、债务重组、潜在主权违约，包括阿根廷、巴基斯坦和肯尼亚，以及需要增加对较贫穷国家的贷款，以促进发展和应对气候变化。耶伦将在全球会议上关注世界银行和中国。彭博社，美国财政部长珍妮特·耶伦预计将在即将进行的为期9天的国际访问中讨论世界银行改革，会见中国高级官员，并可能讨论限制俄罗斯石油销售收入的方法。耶伦将出席在摩洛哥马拉喀什举行的国际货币基金组织和世界银行年会，并就世界银行改革发表演讲。耶伦还可能会见中国同行，进一步改善两国经济关系。此外，他还将讨论增加国际货币基金组织配额，并解决低收入国家债务重组协议的问题。由于房地产危机，中国经济学家将增长预测下调至 5%。日经亚洲，经济学家将中国全年经济增长预期下调至 5%， 理由是房地产市场动荡以及缺乏有效的刺激措施。29位分析师对2023年 GDP 的平均预测下降了 0.5个百分点，其中26位经济学家较上季度下调了预期。对中国 GDP 增长的预测范围在 4.5% 至 5.6% 之间，其中12位经济学家的预测低于北京 5% 左右的官方目标。房地产低迷加深，外需进一步减弱，政策支持力度不及预期。与房地产相关的投资和消费下滑，疲弱的消费者信心削弱了对2023年快速增长的预期，而经济学家预期的刺激增长的政府政策并未实现。第三季度 GDP 同比增长平均预测为 4.4%。对政府实施扭转房地产市场低迷政策的希望已经破灭，而主要开发商陷入困境的消息则进一步令市场观察人士失望。东京以日本回来了的信息吸引世界投资。金融时报，日本首相岸田文雄一直试图说服全球投资者看好日本，称该国经济和工资在多年停滞后更加强劲，股价接近33年来的高点，资产也正在重组管理行业，可以释放14万亿美元的家庭储蓄。然而，投资者警告说，日本的吸引力可能是短暂的，因为该国受益于全球通胀、日美利差以及中国地缘政治不确定性等外部因素。通过中国简报了解全球与中国相关的最新新闻、分析和政策简报。我们的团队从各种来源，包括媒体、智囊团、政府机构和行业专家汇总、综合和总结最重要的信息。我们的使命是为您提供适合您感兴趣的特定领域的易于访问且极具价值的信息。我们了解与中国相关的最新动态的重要性，并致力于让我们的读者能够理解这些信息。访问我们的网站，加入对话，并了解与中国相关的最新新闻和动态。3w.6dobrief.com。
观众朋友们好，感谢大家来到今天的华尔街论坛节目现场。今天一早整个市场最关注的就是美国最新的就业数字的变化。那么从数字上，我们看到9月份美国的非农就业人数是增加到了33.6万人，比之前市场经济学家普遍预计的17万人可以说是有大幅度的创升也是今年以来的最大的增幅。那么这样的消息一出很多人对于美国的经济前景又重新归于乐观。数字是不是真的这么简单呢？我们仔细看这一次新增的就业岗位主要是集中在休闲酒店行业、政府卫生保健以及社会救助等岗位。但是有一点需要大家注意，就是虽然就业人数出现了猛增的趋势，平均的薪资却出现了略微下调的趋势。因此也有经济学家说，接下来还要看更进一步的数字，新增的就业岗位是不是多以半职或者是临时工为主，全职就业人数的恢复状况又如何？尽管整个9月份我们看到了是就业人数增长强于预期，但是在过去的几个月里面，各种迹象也显示，美国实际上整个就业市场还是存在着相当多的脆弱点，比如劳工冲突问题，再比如整个科技行业的裁员问题等等。大家当然最担心的还是就业数字大超预期，是不是又进一步的增加了美联储继续加息的压力？现在这已经成为市场非常敏感并且紧切的一点，因为我们也知道很多美国人的不管是房贷也好，还是一般性的借款也好，如果我们说利息再高，那就会大大增加他们的偿付成本。所以这一点也是现在市场观察家所特别注意到的。而说到外交方面，我们关注到的是来自路透社的一条独家报道，习近平可能会在本月月底或者是下月月初的时候，对于东南亚的近邻越南进行出访。之前我们也看到拜登总统赴越南，并且大幅提升了与越南的伙伴关系。在这样的一个关口，是不是习近平也不能落后，也需要向河内方面表达某一种善意呢？这是我们现在特别关注到的话题。同时，习近平外访的近期的记录似乎也不只是越南。在昨天晚些时候，如果您有关注到华尔街网报的话呢，我们引述来自华盛顿邮报的独家报道，为大家介绍，美国政府官员认为，现在习近平会出席 APEC 在旧金山举行的亚太经合峰会，基本上已经确定了。而白宫方面也是开展了一系列的准备工作。当然了，这个消息随后也被国安委再次降调。国安委目前表示还没有得到来自中国方面的最终确认。此前我们也向您报道，中国的外长王毅会在本月月底的某个时候到美国来。那么那个时候可能会向美国方面传达更加明确的说法，习近平到底会不会来出席这一次峰会。好了，以上就是我们为大家带来的华尔街六度这个栏目的主要内容。那么如果你有关注到中国简报的话呢，在刚刚过去的这一天里，还有非常多的其他的精彩的市场内容，我们在这里就不再赘述了。今天在华尔街科技这个栏目，我们特别要为大家介绍的是昨天发表在华尔街日报上以及纽约时报上的相关的报道，有关于华为的芯片禁令，现在是引起了市场很多的关注。但是大家可能想不到的是，有很多企业来游说美国政府，希望他们不要加强对于中国的芯片制裁，而其中不乏是美国的芯片巨头以及科技企业，包括高通包括英伟达等等。为什么他们希望不要对于中国进行更进一步的芯片禁令呢？想让今天来给我们讲一讲这个故事到底是怎么回事
这个周末之前其实在这个昨天10月5日稍晚的时候，现在路透社有一个比较是及时的信息，说的是有一位政府公告和消息人士，他们说限制美国芯片制造设备出口到中国的最新规定已经进入了最后的审查阶段，这表明拜登政府很快会收紧对北京的限制。那么来自路透社的这个报道就提到，消息人士说这些更新将增加限制，并弥补2022年10月7日首次公布的这个规则中的漏洞。这些规定是激怒了北京使中美关系进一步紧张。在当地时间的10月4日呢，美国管理和预算办公室 OMB 他们的网站上发布了一个题为半导体制造项目出口管制实体清单的修改。 那一个不愿这个匿名人士就证实啊，这一则消息指的就是向中国运送芯片制造工具的预期限制。与此同时呢，《纽约时报》就有一篇长文披露了美国3大芯片巨头啊，包括英特尔、包括高通，还有英伟达，他们联手抵制拜登政府收紧对中国芯片出口的一个内幕。拜登政府在采取了首次限制向中国出售半导体的重大举措1年之后，已经开始起草我们刚才说的这个进一步限制的措施。那么目的就是要剥夺北京获得更现代化武器所必须的一些关键技术。但是在最近几个月，美国芯片公司的这个反弹，减缓了这一进展。他们是发出了一项非常直白的警告，那就是说如果说削减对中国的销售，那将严重损害这几家公司的业务，直接会导致政府在美国建设新的半导体工厂的计划。在7月以来，全世界最大的3家芯片制造商英伟达、英特尔还有高通是一直在敦促政府重新考虑进一步的芯片管制措施。他们认为对中国采取强硬措施将产生意想不到的后果。那根据与政府、行业还有政策组织的20多名官员的采访，那这些他们在会晤了这个国务卿布林肯还有商务部部长雷蒙多等官员时，是质疑了白宫的国家安全战略还有智慧，那争取了智库的支持，还敦促华盛顿各界领袖要重新考虑对芯片的额外的控制。这些公司的警告简单来说就是美国公司的退出，那可能会加速中国独立芯片产业的发展，为一个由中国创造的芯片主导的世界铺平道路，而不是由美国设计的芯片去主导一个世界。那英伟达的这个总法律顾问蒂姆·泰特也协助了领导游说活动。他认为美国收紧对华芯片出口，那就是一场巨大的冒险。此举那是刺激对手发展由其领导的芯片生态系统，这会对美国在半导体先进技术以及人工智能领域的领导力产生极其负面的影响。有2个知情人士就透露说，这场游说活动也导致了拜登政府推迟出台新的对华芯片出口限制措施，并缩小了政府可能做出的改变的范围。负责制定规则的这个美国商务部和国家安全委员会的发言人则说呢，他们是致力于保护敏感技术保护在美国境内。不过大型芯片公司的这一个游说努力也激怒了一些国家安全专家，还有国会议员和半导体的竞争对手。许多人是支持对抗北京的这么一个做法。他们认为美国才刚刚通过这个芯片和科学法案，承诺向芯片行业提供500亿美元的资金，这些公司没过多久就开始质疑白宫，这个令人反感。根据2位知情人士的说法，威斯康星州的众议员麦克加拉格尔已经与其他的议员讨论过要与芯片公司举行听证会的事宜，质疑他们是否遵守了出口管制。那芯片巨头的警告则表明，美国国家安全担忧与企业商业利益之间存在着紧张的关系，也凸显出拜登政府面临的一个无法回避的困境，那就是美国和中国在经济上的相互依存的关系可以追溯到几十年前。华盛顿采取的任何对中国限制的行动都可能对美国本身造成伤害。中国是约占全世界半导体市场的1/3，为英伟达、英特尔还有高通创造了总计超过500亿美元的年营收入。这3家公司在中国都有大量的业务。那高通是为小米等手机制造商提供芯片，有64%的公司营收都来自于中国。中国是为英特尔、英伟达分别贡献了大约1/4和1/5的营收。这些公司都有警告说，失去这些收入可能会迫使他们削减技术开发的资金、就业岗位以及在亚利桑那州、俄亥俄州和纽约州半导体工厂的支出。时间回到去年10月，2022年10月的时候，当拜登政府出台限制措施对中国芯片出口时，这些公司呢，当时是默默接受了，也被迫调整了业务。比如英伟达，它为中国的市场开发出了降级版的芯片。但时间回到2023年的7月，当时有消息传出，拜登政府是考虑进一步扩大限制的措施，这一点就让美国芯片业的高管提高了警惕。由于担心在华业务进一步受到打击，英特尔 CEO 这个 帕特基辛格，那高通的 CEO 克里斯蒂亚诺安蒙以及英伟达的 CEO 黄仁勋是一起前往了华盛顿，与白宫的官员进行磋商。基辛格在7月份出席阿斯彭安全论坛时也说他们会见了布林肯、雷蒙多，还有国家安全顾问沙利文，向这些高级官员概述了无法进入中国所要付出的代价，并警告这一个可能会迫使他们削减在美国的支出。有2位知情人士还说在与白宫官员的谈话中英特尔的高管还质疑了美国国家安全委员会的助手是否了解半导体技术。与此同时，这些公司也敦促他们所在的行业组织美国半导体行业协会 SIA 发表声明，批评政府的限制措施是宽泛的、模棱两可的，有时甚至是单方面的。而 SIA 则警告说进一步的限制措施将损害美国芯片行业的竞争力。另外还有3人透露说在起草这个声明时，其实在 SIA 内部没有成员是公开反对，但后面有几个成员后来表示，由于拜登政府支持芯片和科学法案，这让他们感到不安。那这些半导体美国的公司还扩大了他们的游说范围，瞄准了智库的研究人员。在2023年的夏天，黄仁勋还会见了安全组织的领导人，包括战略与国际问题研究中心，还有大西洋理事会。那有4名知情人士就进一步的补充说英伟达对智库的兴趣是引起了一些人的警觉。华盛顿则传出消息说英伟达曾对支持出口限制的格雷戈里·艾伦的研究提出过质疑。艾伦这位是战略与国际问题研究中心下属高级研究中心的主任，不过这个战略与国际问题研究中心则表示英伟达在这一期中没有不当的行为。对此英伟达的总法律顾问泰特则回应说公司从未对艾伦他的工作提出过任何的异议。英伟达的说法是，我们相信艾伦所呈现的是他所能提供的最佳研究成果，我们也完全尊重这一点。而除了会见这个白宫的高级官员之外英特尔、高通还有英伟达这3大巨头的 CEO 还见了谷歌的前 CEO 兼董事长埃里克·施密特。自2018年卸任谷歌的执行董事长以来，施密特已经成为华盛顿的重要人物。他在2个国防部顾问委员会任职，也出资成立了自己的智库，名叫特别竞争研究计划。他此前是支持限制中国获得美国设计的半导体。那么有2位知情人士还透露在今年7月的中旬，基辛格、安蒙以及黄仁勋还和施密特讨论了芯片限制的隐患。这个施密特虽然没有对这个评论做出任何的回复但是其实在我们之前的节目中包括华尔街论坛以及这个思想先驱报，我们也有分享过这个施密特在于外交事务以及外交政策这些媒体上的一些文章。在上个月，施密特的智库曾邀请基辛格和黄仁勋在华盛顿举行的一个关于国家安全和技术的年度会议上进行一个炉边谈话，但是2位高管都没有回应有关半导体的限制和中国的问题。所以这个《纽约时报》的这篇文章是为我们汇总了一个在过去的1年多的时间随着拜登政府他们的限制对华限制的一个芯片法案的逐步的收紧，那么包括高通、包括英特尔、包括英伟达他们所遇到的一些困境以及所做出的一些回应。但是这个事情仍然在发展，我们也会继续加以关注。
的确那么小杨刚才说的非常清楚了。实际上呢，对于中国的这个芯片禁令就是叫进退维谷2重困境，做得过多或者是做得过少，可能都会对美国企业以及美国自己的国家安全造成伤害。如果呢对于中国完全没有限制，那么可能导致美国最高级的技术直接流入中国，甚至美国最担心的就是流入解放军手中，可能会被用于在美国看来对于自由世界侵害性的目的，对于美国自己也造成安全性的威胁。但是如果把中国限得过死，那么可能导致的一个结果就是美国自己企业的市场出现了大幅的收缩。我们也知道美国那么企业的营收中有相当一部分要重新投资于研发，一旦营收收入出现了大幅的下降，相应的研发收入也下降了，这样可能反噬 制美国企业自己，降低美国企业的创新步伐。刚才啊，小杨也特别提到了 CSIS 的这一位专家啊，叫做 Gregory Allen 啊，叫做艾伦先生。那么就在我们节目刚刚播出的时候呢，我也看到艾伦先生在 Twitter 上面发布啊，说他们呢正好是完成了一份最新的研究报告。这一份研究报告呢，是对于华为的 Mate 手机进行了全方位的专业性的性能评估，包括对于华为传说中的5G 芯片到底是何方神圣进行了一个严谨的分析。今天稍后啊，在华尔街电视的华尔街智库栏目中啊，我们的导播也会为大家完整的讲述，并且呢复述整篇报告中的内容。大家可以看一看 CSIS 这样的一位 AI 以及芯片的专家，现在对于华为 Mate 60手机性能的评估到底是怎么样的。说完了科技相关的话题啊，我们再来谈一谈安全有关的问题。来自南华早报一篇非常有趣的文章，其中啊就讲到了中国这个国安部门呢，在我们的印象中是一个比较神秘的部门啊，也不知道他们平时的运作状况到底是如何的。那么提起国安，大家可能想到的是啊，对于网络进行监控啊，对于网络进行侵袭、黑客等等等等，甚至啊情报战、间谍战啊，这样我们在小说中看到的词汇，往往是与国安这个部门联系在一起的。但是现任的国安沙皇陈一新与前任相比，形势却更加高调。来自南华早报的文章特别分析到，现在呀，陈一新是走向了舞台中央，不仅仅是就国安事务进行发言和评论，甚至在传统的外交和宣传部门应该管的对于社交媒体的舆论管控方面，似乎啊也是发挥了角色。这到底是怎么回事呢？那我们也知道啊，陈一新这个人物，我们可能了解中国政治的朋友们也听说过。那么我最早注意到这个名字，还是在武汉疫情期间，陈一新是临危领命到武汉负责湖北当地的疫情防控机构。但是近期啊，中国观察者们特别注意到的是，中国国安机构在8月份最新推出了一个微信公众账号，随后啊就在中国的社交媒体上发表了大量有关于中美关系的评论。观察者们有一些好奇，有一些担忧，中美关系这不是应该外交口管的事情吗？怎么现在归属国安部这个部门来进行评论了？国安部的权力是不是已经触角延伸啊，侵占了传统上属于其他机构的一些职权范围呢？的确，来自南华早报的评论报道啊，就观察到，在陈一新被任命为国安沙皇之后的这1年里，整个国安部的行事风格变得更加高调。不管是打击外国间谍、更新安全法，还是在社交媒体上高调的公布一些所谓的情报案件的更多的细节，都让人觉得这一个传统神秘在暗角的机构已经走到了我们视线的中央。前一段时间啊，还特别由国安部下属的媒体账号发布动员和组织人民群众预防制止间谍活动的这样的一个活动啊，甚至呢还专门开发了一个单独的微信账号，希望中国民众提供有关于外国间谍可疑活动的线索，全民抓间谍，人心惶惶，更是让人觉得国安部这个机构到底要做什么。而说到陈一新本人，他与习近平呢是有非常亲密的长期关系。陈一新呢其实还有一个特点，就是号称呢曾经是习近平的鬼魂写手，或者呢我们叫做笔杆子。有很多在浙江期间署名习近平的文章和评论，据说呢都是出自于陈一新之手。之前呢我们在节目中也为大家介绍到陈一新呢非常擅长利用社交媒体作为宣传工具。在这个之前陈一新在政法部门任职的时候，大家可能记得微博上有一个号叫做长安剑政法委长安剑，大家也都知道这就是政法委旗下的官方账号。那么这个长安剑的文风就被认为是以犀利著称的，经常有很多广为中国民众，特别是中国一些鹰派民众所追捧的文章，出自于长安剑之手。而最近呢，外企特别担忧的就是国安委在5月份批准的有关于加强国安教育的文件，还有就是修订最新的反间谍法，其中有关于网络间谍和处罚的新条款，引起了大家很大的不安。而如果大家看到近期有关于中国经济的评论报道，可能经常会看到这样的说法， 就是现在中国已经不再是以经济发展为第一要务了，现在啊强调的是安全与发展并重，把安全提高到了更高的位置。但是也有反对的声音说啊，国安委的这一些宣传更多的可能主要还是面对国内的受众，外交部仍然是外交政策和中美关系之间真正的掌舵者。当然掌舵者这个词啊也是要带上引号的，他们虽然是执行机构，真正的外交决策和安全决策还是由习近平一个人负责。来自南华早报的文章还特别引述清华大学的一位高级研究专家认为，现在啊国安委的很多社交媒体的行动是带有陈一新的标志性的特征啊。那么他啊与这个美国啊以及其他一些国家的情报部门在社交媒体上主要是用于招募这样的功能性质目的不同，国安委的这个微信账号主要呢变成是国安事务的一个宣传渠道。当然了，更让大家觉得惊讶也觉得有一点有意思的就是他发表的文章啊往往是引起了很大的共鸣。根据来自南华早报的统计啊，国安委这个账号从8月份开始之后发布了几十篇文章，其中啊超过30几篇都是10万加的高流量啊这样的一个阅读量，而同时发布的几段小视频点击量和观看量也都超过100万，不仅仅是数量，这个流行程度也是与很多官方的这样的一些渠道性的账号有很大的不同。因此在今天我们也特别为大家介绍这样的一篇文章。但是说到安全问题啊，现在有很多外国企业的负责人仍然对于中国最近对于安全事项的突然升调感到不满。比如我们看到之前3月的时候，中国是突袭了美国的一家尽职调查公司啊 Mintz Group 的北京办事处，还拘留了5位员工。1个月之后，当地的警方又盘问了咨询巨头贝恩在上海办事处的员工。而Capvision 昨天我们为大家介绍到，这样的一家咨询网络公司的多个办事处也受到了突袭。到底这些企业受到了什么样的麻烦我们不知道，但是据说他们都涉嫌到了违反国家安全的有关行为。来自南华早报的报道特别引述纽约一家咨询公司负责中国市场的一位高级合伙人说其中有一些企业之所以受到搜查和影响，可能是因为他们参与了涉及新疆棉制裁问题的尽职调查。那我们也知道，美国之前通过的防止维吾尔族强迫劳动法要求企业，如果你的供应链有涉新疆，需要在出口美国时详细说明为什么你没有违反美国的相关制裁法律。那么这呢，其实是法律步骤中的合理一步，也是必经之途。但是在中国看来，涉及到对于中国新疆问题的调查，可能已经造成了不稳定因素。而同时这一位消息人士还表示我们也知道什么对于外国间谍的人民战争，这只是中国政府内部的一种宣传的噱头。但是这个反间谍法含糊不清，特别是限制数据外流的有关规定，让我们觉得十分的紧张。严格的说，如果他们真的要100%的遵守有关于数据外流的相关法律，这一些外国企业在中国的团队就根本没有办法向美国发送包含研究数据的电子邮件，而这在这一些跨国企业看来简直是太过疯狂了。当然有关于这一点不知道是不是中国的相关部门也听到了这一些外企的紧张态势在之前的1周最新通过的这一本数据安全法的相关修订意见稿中，对于整个到底什么数据可以出境，什么数据不能出境，是进行了更加细致的规定和规范。那么呢这样的一个数据修订意见草案出台，也让很多外企可以说是长舒一口气。当然具体的情况如何，陈一新的国安委到底现在只是进行一些所谓的对内的宣传噱头，还是真的会有更加严厉的行动呢？我们还要拭目以待。那何明先生之前在我们节目中也说希望陈一新你要是抓间谍，就真的抓出一些严肃的，让我们觉得还真的是个像样的间谍，不要光搞一些陈年的旧案，也不要光搞一些情报机构的线人，像之前我们说的这个香港裔的某一位爱国侨领这样的一些案件。那么有关于陈一新到底有什么样的行动，我们也随时为大家关注。 再要为大家看到的呀，是来自《华尔街日报》的一篇最新报道。那我们看到啊，习近平近期有一系列国际访问活动，除了我们刚才说的会在近期去越南河内进行访问，来到美国旧金山参与 APEC 峰会。那么之前我们也为大家介绍到，即将在中东举行的全球气候峰会，这个习近平很有可能也会去走一趟。从目前的态势来看，大家最关注的还是习近平访美，而从昨天传出的消息来看，基本已经板上钉钉子了，白宫方面也开始筹备有关的事项。当然，这里我们也要为大家提醒，不到最后一刻，一般中国方面是不会给出官方的确认消息的。而在从现在我们看到10月初到11月初还有1个月，中国和美国之间仍然可能会出现很多的意外。大家最关心也是最敏感的一个话题，就是之前美国方面已经提前向中国照会的，可能会再次升级对于中国的芯片以及制裁禁令，这呀也是中国方面十分敏感的一个话题。如果习近平比如说在下周见了参议院的2党领袖，结果美国回头就给中国了一个新的追加制裁，那么不是让习近平脸上无光吗？对于香港特首李家超的制裁是不是会有放松，现在也是中国和美国角力的焦点。美国方面现在呢已经明确表示要禁止李家超以及其他被禁止的香港官员来美国出席亚太经合峰会，而中国方面此前呢是向美国提出要以取消对于李家超的制裁作为习近平出席亚太峰会的一个前提条件。李家超的问题是不是可能有新的转机，这也是一个重要的焦点。而除此之外，中美关系在有关于贸易、制裁，包括在军事和人员往来之上还有很多其他的敏感话题，比如有关于芬太尼，这呀一直是影响美国人生命健康的重要焦点。而美国在之前也通过了一系列对于中国涉嫌非法走私芬太尼公司的制裁。再比如，美国方面呢，仍然有几位公民在中国现在不得出境处理，这一些美国公民在中国的待遇条件以及领事监视权是不是能够得到基本的保护，所有这一些都是中美角力的要点。而同时在昨天在布鲁金斯研究所的这样的一个有关于中国力量的演讲活动中，我们也注意到五角大楼的一位高级官员拉特纳进行了主旨讲话。在讲话中他也特别提到，近期五角大楼特别是奥斯汀房长本人多次向中国方面提出了照会的要求，但是悉数全部被中国拒绝了。现在中国和美国的军事高层仍然没有恢复正常的交流，而同时他也特别表示，实质的交流没有恢复，对于中美关系随时脱轨仍然是一个潜在的风险。这一些问题能不能够在近期得到改善和解决，还是可能会出现新的危机点和恶化趋势，都对于习近平是否出访仍然可能造成更多的威胁。那么相关话题，特别是拉特纳先生的这一次演讲其中可以说是信息量非常的大，我们也会在今天晚些时候在华尔街电视的华尔街智库节目中为大家进行现场的播报和更加详细的介绍。说完了外交方面的话题我们再来看到的是现在外企特别关注的另外一个话题，就是到了中国之后做生意还能不能够顺势出离那我们也知道，中国政府现在对于外国企业的待遇不像过去这样，过去似乎是请了个财神来帮助中国提升技术实力，帮助中国开拓市场，特别是很多外国的高科技公司和金融企业。中国一直有一句话叫做借船出海，引入一条大鲶鱼，帮助中国带火本土的市场。但是近期中国政府推出了一系列对于外国银行家和高管的出境禁令，加剧了大家对于赴华商务旅行的担忧。根据《华尔街日报》的独家报道，现在有一些公司已经明确取消或者是推迟了国际部门高管的旅行，还有一些公司呢维持了旅行计划，但是增加了一些最新的安全保障措施，比如告诉他们所在企业的员工，你们可以集体去中国，但是不能单独入境，以避免受到中国方面的骚扰，或者是造成更大的麻烦。来自《华尔街日报》引述一位大型企业的这样的一位管理者说近期美国公司取消或者是推迟赴华商务旅行的情况增加了25%之多。 而《华尔街日报》也查阅了9月份公布的一项美国政府部门的相关调查，发现有近1/5的企业受访者都表示要减少前往中国的商务旅行。中国和美国之间有很多焦灼点，不管是台湾芯片竞争等等等等。但是传统上而言，大家一直认为商务活动是比较安全的一个领域，经贸活动是中美之间相对不那么敏感的一个方面。近期这样的情况似乎有所变化。之前我们在节目中也为大家介绍，美国风险咨询公司克洛尔驻港的一位高级管理人员，过去2个月已经被告知不得离开大陆。而野村的一位高级投行银行家也是因为要在中国配合对于包凡案件的调查，而不被准许离开大陆。中国政府是不是真的是因为要调查相关的法律案件，要求他们配合调查，暂时要求他们不得离境呢？还是利用旅行限制本身来在与外国公司和政府的纠纷中获得更多筹码呢？其中有一个重要的问题就是，对于中国而言，出境禁令到底什么时候结束，因为什么样的调查案件展开，往往十分不透明。有一些出境禁令甚至可以持续数年。某一位受到出境禁令限制的人，可能没有与犯罪嫌疑人有直接的关系，也没有与案件有直接的联系。现在根据熟悉相关案件的人士说，之前我们提到的克洛尔公司的高管，还有野村的银行家，都是属于这样模糊地带的这样的案件可能他们相关的生意伙伴或者是熟人中有哪一个人在中国遇到了法律的麻烦，但是他们本人其实都不是中国当局调查的直接目标。来自《华尔街日报》的报道还特别引述美国私人保安公司的一位首席执行官说过去的8个月里，他有相当多的客户，不管是国际律师事务所、国际咨询企业，还是其他外企，都遇到了一个麻烦，就是在中国的机场直接刚入境的时候，或者是刚刚到酒店的时候就被遭遇了拘留，在机场有的时候被软性审问，长达几个小时，甚至有的时候超过5个小时之多。这一位消息人士表示好像只有在好莱坞的电影里面才能够看到这一种情况，真的是很让人觉得不安。哪一些人最有可能受到中国出境禁令的相关影响呢？首先，如果你有从军的经历，比如你曾经是五角大楼的雇佣者，或者你曾经加入美军，曾经有军事方面的相关的合同。还有一个重要的敏感点，就是如果你有双重国籍，还有就是如果你曾经在社交媒体上发表过一些政治敏感的帖子或者是言论，如果你有这一些问题，那么你很有可能会在中国面临被当局拘留，风险更大。因此，现在有很多美国企业在派驻他们自己的外国企业员工到中国之前，也开始要请安全顾问公司对于这一些员工进行背景调查，看一看他们是不是属于在中国可能遭遇出境禁令的高危人群。因此，我们也看到现在很多外国企业对于中国也是两手打算。一方面既希望利用中国庞大的市场以及中国更多的机会，同时对于本国的员工派驻中国也是更加加强了安全方面的审查。当然，也不是所有的人都避中国而远去。比如来自《华尔街日报》这一篇文章就特别提到苹果公司的库克、摩根大通的戴蒙、特斯拉的马斯克等首席执行官今年都对中国进行了高调访问，而中国方面也特别希望能够吸引到外国企业的高管，作为中国和美国之间的某一些传声筒和桥梁。世界经济论坛即将举办，这一场会议被称为夏季达沃斯，届时也会邀请大批海外企业的高管。而同时我们也看到比如像著名的制药公司默克集团的首席执行官说，现在员工还在赴中国开展重要的合作活动，展开关键业务会议等。但是不管怎么说，如果您是属于有双重国籍这一种情况，或者是您的背景中有曾经为美军或者是其他军事部门效劳，那么也希望您在赴华旅行之前了解相关的风险， 并且随时关注美国国务院有关于赴中国旅行的更多的警示。同时，我们也特别提醒他，如果您要是到中国来进行相关旅行的话，也要对自己携带的电子设备进行一次提前的安全查处。华尔街日报特别表示，提醒大家不要携带日常经常用的手机和电脑，最好呢是有一个一次性的设备。如果真的是要使用自己常用的设备，也要注意其中是不是包含了一些数据或者是应用程序，特别是之前在社交媒体上的一些言论，是不是可以让中国官方直接找到您本人。那我也知道我们的这个观众朋友中有非常多是从事国际商务、中美业务以及其他中国和世界相关商务以及金融活动的这样的一些朋友。这一点我们在节目中也特别向大家进行提醒。好了，以上就是我们在今天的华尔街论坛节目中为大家带来的主要内容。今天特别感谢给我们打赏支持的观众朋友们，有甜点，有如是我闻，还有 JZ， 谢谢这些观众朋友们对于我们节目的支持。稍后华尔街联报继续为大家带来过去24小时的最新消息。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。据彭博新闻社报道，有几家台湾科技公司正在帮助华为在中国南部为一个不引人注意的芯片工厂建设基础设施。这种不寻常的合作有可能会激化台海矛盾。根据彭博新闻社的调查，这些公司包括台湾芯片材料公司、西科宏盛、崇越科技、亚翔工程等4家公司。由于台湾与大陆之间的紧张关系，台湾参与华为的努力可能会引发强烈抵制，而不稳定的台海关系是台湾明年1月总统选举的一个关键问题。台湾经济部部长王美花周三表示，他已经同意对这种不寻常的关系展开调查。台湾立法会议员要求在1个月内提供有关调查的初步报告。经济部官员表示，将主要调查这些公司是否在台北批准的申请范围内在中国大陆开展业务。反对人士担心，这些在台湾公司帮助下建造的华为工厂所生产的芯片，最终可能用于中国针对台湾的行动。如果蔡英文政府不加强对本土企业支持华为的控制，那么它就不是认真对待台湾的国防。华为可以说最近在各个方面都处于风口浪尖。华为8月下旬推出一款采用先进中国制造芯片的智能手机后，也引起了华盛顿的警惕，并且呼吁彻底切断华为与芯片制造商中芯国际的联系。现在华为的一举一动都会引起激烈争论，连五眼情报组织也坚称华为 5G 技术存在巨大的情报风险。华为当然是否认这一指控。5G 技术的出现可以说导致了国家之间正式的秘密战争，它甚至被纳入军情六处的报告中，并称中国将最终凭借这项技术接管世界的领导地位。全世界的官员都非常关心 5G， 并且与中国进行各种对抗，但实际上对 5G 技术发展的细节我们知之甚少。华为是如何达到今天的技术实力，令西方国家如此警惕的呢？这背后华为要感激一个土耳其人。在2018年，任正非在深圳举办了一场非凡的仪式，他邀请了一位土耳其科学家来到深圳的会议中心，并向他颁发了精致奖章，以表彰他对通信技术发展的杰出贡献。这个人就是被称为极化码之父的阿里坎。极化码是一种新型的编码方式，已经被列入 5G 移动通信的控制信道编码，这是信道编码领域近年来的重大突破。在华为准备的仪式中，伴随着莫扎特的土耳其进行曲，大家热烈庆祝阿里坎教授的到来。任正非也亲自走上红毯迎接他。为什么要如此兴师动众呢？因为阿里坎解决了信息世界长达半个世纪的问题。阿里坎是一位幸运的科学家，他在2008年发表的极地码学术研究，在短短10年后就得到了实现。他原本并不认为实际应用会在短时间内实现。他在华为为他举行的仪式上说，对于科学家来说，没有什么比看到自己的想法变成现实是更大的回报了。华为也感谢阿里坎，因为正是他为华为在 5G 技术上提供了巨大的竞争优势。华为 CEO 郭平当时说，阿里坎不仅是土耳其的英雄，也是通信行业的英雄。 它的发明和对电信业的改进将会重塑信息世界，也许将影响到下一个世纪。5G 的速度要比 4G 快100倍，每公里可以连接1000万台设备，其大容量可以使数字产业渗透到生活的方方面面。世界经济论坛和电子工程协会等国际组织指出， 5G 将会打开新应用的大门，提高机器人、物联网、机对机通信领域的效率。这种新的移动技术将会引发工业革命，因为有了 5G， 云计算、人工智能、工业物联网才可以瞬间连接一切，也就是说及时监控数据，并且在很短的时间内达到先进算法的分析。它带来的结果就是工厂可以最有效地利用资源和能源进行定制生产，而不会造成浪费。医院可以提供个性化的医疗服务，城市管理部门可以及时控制城市上层建筑和基础设施，可以预测电力、水和天然气网络的故障，可以及时改变红绿灯等待时间，优先考虑繁忙方向。而无人驾驶汽车、无人机和机器人等自主物体也可以因为及时数据的获得而更加安全、精确地移动。这也正是为什么华为在掌握了 5G 技术之后，令西方世界如此警惕的原因。然而 5G 技术也有更高的要求，它需要更多的基站，更多的基站也就意味着更高的投资成本和更多的能源消耗。正是在这里，阿里坎发明的新编码方法极地码开始发挥作用。极地码不仅可以显著提高 5G 的通信性能，还可以通过降低编码复杂度来节省能源。那么现在美国限制华为使用 5G 技术，然而上个月华为以一款自己研发的 5G 手机卷土重来，在美国制裁的情况下意外重返 5G 市场，令人刮目相看。而在此期间，正值任正非的女儿孟晚舟担任华为轮值董事长。孟晚舟于今年4月1号出任华为轮值董事长，任期于本月10月1号结束。在过去的6个月中，孟晚舟监督了华为新手机的推出，并且进行了多次高调演讲。分析人士认为，他巩固了任正非接班人的地位。华为的新款智能手机有什么意义呢？金融时报分析认为，这表明习近平一如既往地致力于自给自足，并将西方芯片制造商挤出中国市场。北京自2014年推出首个大型半导体补贴基金以来，用国产零部件替代进口芯片一直是中国的既定目标。然而到目前为止，在中国销售的大多数手机，甚至是 OPPO 和小米等本土品牌，内部都装满了外国制造的芯片。华为的新手机 Mate 60 Pro 则是不同，它可能是有史以来最中国的智能手机。除了手机的主要7纳米处理器之外，手机中的许多辅助芯片也都是国产的，包括蓝牙、WiFi 和电源管理芯片。9月25号，华为在深圳举办最新产品发布会。发布会上，华为避免谈论 Mate 60，但是展示了平板电脑和其他设备，并且誓言要提高智能手机产量，以满足不断增长的需求。与美国的紧张关系也激发了国内对这些设备的热情。近日，在上海的一家华为专卖店，一位一直在使用 iPhone 的消费者表示，想换成华为手机，以此支持中国的自制品牌。而随着华为新手机的上架，北京也同时宣布设立一项400亿美元的新基金，继续向国内芯片制造商提供补贴。北京似乎还帮助解决针对华为的主要竞争对手苹果。华为手机发布之际，有报道称，中国政府机构和国有企业不鼓励员工购买苹果手机。而美国的半导体行业也越来越反对华盛顿的种种限制。就在今年7月，美国半导体行业的各大首席执行官们还前往华盛顿，共同表态反对对中国实施新的限制。因为随着美国的芯片被中国本地的版本所取代，他们的市场份额将受到严重威胁。经过多年的升级，中美之间的芯片冲突已经到了关键时刻。今年秋天，拜登政府预计将会最终确定出口管制，并且扩大限制中国客户获得美国技术的范围。彭博社指出，最终这场斗争将不是关于智能手机，而是关于人工智能和超级计算等具有战略意义的重要应用，包括军事技术。荣鼎集团的咨询总监则表示，如果华为可以获得高端芯片，那么这些芯片还会去哪里呢？为了摆脱美国的限制，习近平将不得不维持对国内半导体行业极其昂贵的投资，而且没有明确的结束日期。中国政府制定了2014年至2030年间在国内半导体行业投资超过1500亿美元的计划，目标是生产智能手机、 汽车、电脑和其他产品所需的70%的芯片。但是随着现在中国经济陷入困境，这一承诺看起来越来越具有难度。房地产危机将在未来几年内挤压各级政府，限制他们的资源使用。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢，记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道。我们下期节目再见。
We already knew Huawei's Silicon design arm was very capable of designing advanced chips, especially for smartphones. The main question is where Huawei would be able to fabricate such chips since the specific rules on Huawei's Entity List designation came into effect in late 2020. The Entity List provisions for Huawei make it illegal to serve Huawei without a license while using American equipment. SMIC, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, the Chinese company that made the 7nm chip for Huawei, is highly likely to be using American equipment without such a license, so is likely to be in violation of American export controls. Even the electronic design automation (EDA) Huawei used, the software used to design chips, is highly likely to include American EDA tools, though it has long been recognized that this software was the weak link in export controls due to the potential for piracy and hacking. Analyze whether U.S. efforts to restrict investment in and export of advanced chips to China have accelerated the country's indigenous developments of semiconductor self-sufficiency. One major concern has been that American export controls would accelerate the key inputs that the U.S. government is trying to use as choke points, EDA tools and capital equipment. On the EDA side, there are emerging Chinese competitors. However, they have little market presence outside of China and there are structural constraints to these firms becoming peer competitors to the Big Three, Cadence, Synopsys, and Siemens/Mentor Graphics. The primary constraint is that when foundries roll out their leading-edge processes, they work with the Big Three to ensure the smoothness of the design-to-manufacturing interface. This interaction gives the EDA tool vendors a competitive advantage. The foundries are unlikely to bring in other EDA vendors to work at this key interface if these vendors are not already major international vendors offering complete design flow software operating near the international technology frontier. The Chinese EDA vendors do not fit these criteria. For capital equipment, Chinese vendors have made progress in equipment for assembly and testing, although that equipment was not the main focus of the choke points. The main focus was fabrication capital equipment. Here progress has been much more limited, especially at advanced manufacturing nodes. The four most important types of equipment for fabrication are lithography, deposition, etching, and process control, inspection and metrology equipment. Lithography equipment, equipment that uses light and direct beams to pattern circuitry onto wafers, is dominated by the Netherlands ASML with some minor Japanese competitors. China already cannot purchase the most advanced equipment, extreme ultraviolet (EUV) lithography equipment, and from September 2023 onwards cannot purchase ASML's second most advanced equipment, argon fluoride immersion (ARFI) deep ultraviolet (DUV) equipment. China's Shanghai Microelectronics Equipment (SME) has yet to launch any fab-ready equipment despite years of hype, though there is talk yet again that SME will launch lithography equipment suitable for 28nm processes this autumn. Even if SME pulls off this feat, it will still be far behind the technology frontier. In deposition, adding thin layers of materials and then energy to induce a chemical reaction, there are at least 5 Chinese producers reportedly undertaking mass production of equipment: Piotech, Nora, AMEC, ACMR, and Wanya. Nora and Piotech are the main vendors by market share. Overall, the local vendors have seized market share, going from 8.5% of domestic Chinese foundry purchases in 2020 to 25% in the first 10 months of 2022. However, Chinese producers are still mainly increasing market share in trailing edge and non-critical processes. In critical and leading-edge applications, such as advanced epitaxial and atomic layer deposition (ALD), Chinese producers haven't made much progress at all. Deposition steps are used more frequently in advanced manufacturing nodes because both the smaller lithography line widths and 3D chip architectures require greater amounts of deposition. Consequently, there has been an increase in demand for deposition equipment. This increased use of deposition in leading-edge processes actually advantages the foreign incumbents in the global market because most of the leading-edge process capacity is offshore thanks to export controls, and foreign producers will be unlikely to commit to using Chinese equipment for critical tasks for both business and geopolitical reasons. Etching, selective removal of materials that have been deposited on the wafer, equipment is dominated by LAM Research, a U.S. firm, followed by Japan's Tokyo Electron and the United States Applied Materials, and technology trends are playing into their dominance. As the technology frontier for fabrication nodes has advanced from 14/16 nanometer to 5 nanometers in logic and from 64L, L stands for layers, to 192L in NAND, the market for etching equipment has doubled. Thus, there is a similar advantage for incumbents with established leading-edge customers to that seen in deposition. The Chinese firms tend to do better at trailing or even just mature, e.g., 28 nanometers, nodes where etching equipment is used less frequently and thus there is lower demand. NORA and AMEC both have entered this market. AMEC offers conductor and dielectric etching equipment at 28 nanometers for non-critical and semi-critical processes and non-critical equipment at 5 nanometers. NORA just offers non-critical and semi-critical equipment at 28 nanometers for conductor etching. Process control equipment is almost all critical equipment because this equipment directly impacts the yield rates of fabrication. Thus, purchasers of such equipment are very circumspect about trying and proven newcomers. This area is also one with among the highest technical barriers to entry. And there is a new incumbent advantage in this sector, as data analytics using data gathered from existing operating machines has become increasingly important to advances in this equipment segment. Given these factors, it is no surprise that, like with lithography, Chinese vendors have made very little progress beyond those simple tasks where the barriers are not high, e.g., inspecting wafers prior to the fabrication process. Given the lack of progress at advanced nodes, it is not surprising that SMIC's advanced fab is chock-a-block full of American equipment often obtained in legally dubious ways as well as Dutch advanced DUV and Japanese equipment obtained before the start of their respective governments' export controls. Identify the key strengths and weaknesses in the China-US contest for silicon supremacy. China's key strengths are its large market demand for chips, its large number of trained engineers in chip design and logic process technology, and government support. China's industrial weaknesses are the key inputs, EDA, and especially capital equipment. Government support is also a double-edged sword as it has encouraged excessive government intervention in management of firms and allocated capital based on metrics other than performance. The U.S. has a deep bench of firms in chip design, e.g., NVIDIA, fabrication, e.g., Intel, and key inputs. However, more than 2 decades of relative government neglect compared to the proactive policies of China, South Korea, and Taiwan have led some of America's deep capabilities to atrophy. Moreover, such neglect has been part of the reason chips have not been viewed as a growth industry by young people, with many more technically minded young people going into software. The CHIPS Act is the start for rectifying this policy neglect. The U.S. needs to address the issue of how to finance chip industry innovation beyond the 5-year timeframe of the CHIPS Act. American venture capital is not interested because of the high upfront costs and low probability of power law returns. America does not have the prodigious amount of patient capital of South Korea or, albeit much more inefficiently, China. How might China's current economic malaise impact the country's advancements in semiconductor development? The Chinese government has already seen lower take-up from regional/local governments in the 3rd tranche of the Big Fund rolled out this year. This lack of enthusiasm suggests that local government debt is beginning to affect an area of great strategic interest to the Chinese state that appeared walled off from any government austerity in the short to medium term. I still think the central government will find the means to fully fund the relatively modest sums needed for the trimmed-down 3rd tranche of the Big Fund, but longer term, the Chinese state will face more and more hard choices between funding industrial policies extravagantly and other core missions of China, such as big budget items like internal security and the military. Assess the impact of China-US chip competition on global supply chains and market share. The revelations emerging from SMIC's fabrication of Huawei's Mate 60 Pro chip show the US has pursued licensing very loosely when it comes to SMIC. In her recent testimony to Congress, U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said that her department would close any loopholes they found. If such measures are taken and no further advanced DUV technology goes to China, China's ability to increase capacity at advanced nodes will be limited. China might face a Galapagos effect in which Chinese equipment suppliers can supply China's maturing fabs while the international market marches ahead with non-Chinese suppliers firmly entrenched. China is hoping to expand rapidly in mature nodes, such as 28 nanometers, because a lot of emerging areas of demand, such as chips for electric vehicles, are at these nodes. Unfortunately for China, Europe and Japan seem very reluctant to accede their automotive industries to China, and the US already has tariffs. Beyond the automotive industry, the appetite of the large foreign markets to accept a flood of Chinese chips at mature nodes is also quite limited given changing geopolitical attitudes.
It is absolutely important to understand China, and it's important to engage with China, and it's really important that I, as the Foreign Secretary of the UK and the other ministers in my department, and indeed other ministers across government, meet with Chinese ministers and Chinese officials, because, you know, pretending that China is not a significant player on the world stage is not a winning strategy. And one of the points I've tried to get across, and sometimes, people don't, some of my dear friends, I don't think, kind of really hear me when I'm saying this, is that engagement with another country is not a prize for good behaviour. It's not some kind of gift or reward. It is work. It's the work that we do, it's the work that we have got to do, and it's the work that we will continue to do. So engaging and understanding, I think, is incredibly important when it comes to foreign policy, yeah.
Mm. And so just on that, in the updated integrated review from earlier this year, the government pledged to double funding for China capabilities across government. So do you know where that money is going at the moment, or if it hasn't been delegated yet, what is on your wish list?
Well, I mean, some of it is about skills, making sure that we have people that speak Mandarin, people that have a proper understanding of China in all its complexities. Some of it is about headcount. Some of it's about having more people. Some of it is about having more points of presence and better points of presence. So some of that will be money spent in China in our network. We have a number of points of presence around China, not just in Beijing. And it won't just be, of course, within the FCDO. It will be in a number of areas across government. So we are all going to have to bid for that extra money. I'd like to think that because it is a pot of money focused on another country, that I'd have a half decent chance of getting at least a decent chunk of that money. But we're going to have to bid. It's going to be competitive, and I think that's good.
And what's the timeline for that?
Well, I think some of that will be dictated by circumstances. One of the lessons that I took, having been a minister in the department, is very little in foreign affairs happens quickly. Developing a cohort of people that have really strong language skills is not an instant fix. So we are going to have a degree of patience about this. And I've often said you can spend money quickly or you can spend money well. And spending money both quickly and well is really quite tough, and I want to make sure that we spend it very well.
Does that also include people that you've called your dear friends, people in the parliamentary party of the Conservatives, who may not understand China as much as they possibly should? is there going to be more training for those, or do you think that they need to understand China more? Maybe they do. You do think that they understand China enough?
Well, I'm not. I think it would be a bit arrogant of me to say they don't understand China. I think they a number of people. I mean, people that I described as dear friends when I was being invited to criticise people who had been critical of me. I made the point that some of the very passionate critics of the decisions that I've made about how we work with China are people who are sanctioned by the Chinese government, and therefore have legitimate reason to be really very frustrated with the behaviour of the Chinese government. And I'm not going to criticise them for responding to being sanctioned in that way. Now, I need to make the case, and I will continue to do so. They have every right. We live in a democratic model where we can have friendly but impassioned disagreement about policy issues. And some of my closest friends in politics disagree with me on some of the direction of travel that I've been taking. I will always listen to them. I will always try and address their concerns as far as I can. I'm not going to start sticking the boot in. But yeah, I want to make sure that right across the system. Oh, please tell me I'm not the only one that can see that happening.
Sorry guys, that's CCP controlled.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I want to make sure that we have a proper, clear-eyed and well-informed debate about how we work, how we engage with, how we trade with, what we choose to do, what we choose not to do with China.
Now, your trip to China earlier this year was one of those things that was a little bit controversial.
Well, I'm going to pull you up on that. Foreign secretary flies to foreign country to have meetings should not be controversial.
I would agree with you on that, and yet it was. So why do you think that is?
Well, because it's China, and as I say, there have been a number of things that China has done, both domestically, regionally, internationally, and directly to some of my parliamentary colleagues, which has angered a lot of people. I think there's there's huge legitimacy towards that anger, but it's my job. It is my job to have meetings like this, to have trips like this, to have those difficult conversations where we need to have difficult conversations face to face and be very, very clear-eyed about those conversations. And I think that I sometimes fear that we've drifted towards a very binary set of habits. And again, that's reflected. I keep being invited. What one word would you use to describe China? And I'm like, well, I don't do that to any other country in the world. No one invites me to say, give me one word to describe your UK's relationship with France. I mean, it's just, and it's weird. Our relationship with China, just like our relationship with every other country around the world, it's complicated, it's multifaceted. There are things that countries do that we agree with and seek to support. There are, even with our closest friends, there are things that they do that we might disagree with, and we raise those issues with them. So the idea of giving this one word descriptor to China, where we don't do it with any other country in the world, I think is foolish.
Now, you say that you raised some of these tough issues with China when you were there. I think some people are skeptical of how much the Chinese listen or care about you raising that kind of stuff. So in those tough conversations then, I mean, what do the Chinese say? Like, what does Foreign Minister Wang Yi say in response to that? How does he react?
So this is, I think, again, give your listeners a little bit of a kind of a peek behind the curtain on how these things work. Often what people say in the room is not the most important thing to take note of. Often the things that they don't say, or how they say it, or the tone of their response, it's that subtleties which, again, why face-to-face meetings is so very, very important. So, for example, when you have a meeting, a bilateral meeting, you'll have the two principals who do all the talking. And in the room, there may be up to a dozen other people.
Especially for the Chinese side.
Yeah, who take copious notes and look very, very carefully. And what my officials are doing is, whilst I'm talking with Foreign Minister Wang Yi, for example, they will be watching how his officials respond to some of the things I say, what their body language says, what things they write frantically, which bits they ignore, which bits that they overlook, which bits does the foreign minister listen to carefully, how long he pauses before he answers, whether his answers are the kind of the pretty much pre-scripted responses to things. For example, when I raised the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, I know exactly what he's going to say because he's said it before. But does he drift off script slightly, or does he stay religiously to the script? Does he say it and say it and say it again, or does he kind of skip past it? These are the kind of things. So certain things I did really very much notice when we spoke. When I talked about China's commercial relationship with the rest of the world, and how many countries, including our own, including the UK, are taking measures to safeguard themselves, and that is having a slowing effect on trade volumes. And I made the point that whether it's the Philippines, who I visited just before going to Beijing, or the UK, or the US, or Australia, or others, we are all taking measures which are just nudging down our trade volumes with China. And the cumulative effect is having a real impact on China. And when I had that discussion, he listened very, very closely. His officials were looking very intently. When I had the conversation about Prigozhin's attempted coup in Russia and how cracks are appearing, and the longer this war goes on, the more likely there is of some unpredictable catastrophic event in Russia, which would be bad news for the UK, bad news for Europe, but particularly bad news for a country like China, which has a land border, extensive land border with Russia. Again, listen very, very carefully when we discussed that. Now, his response was identical to responses I've had from him previously, except it wasn't. And it's those differences mean that these messages are landing, and we do have influence. It's not instant, and it might not even be massive, but we do have influence. And I get very frustrated with my colleagues basically saying, oh, the Chinese don't care what the British think. They really do. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had a 4-hour meeting with their foreign minister.
But would you have liked that meeting to have been longer? I mean, it's a shame it was only one day.
Well, there are a couple of things. There are a couple of points that I really needed to land, and negotiating the logistics of a trip like this are always long and complicated. It's not just a matter of picking up the phone saying, "Are you available on this date?" There's a whole load of things, particularly in the Chinese system. Well, exactly about just simple things like your minister can come, but he has to travel in a Chinese government car, and I'm like, no, I will travel with the ambassador in our car, and so there's loads of things like that. And of course, the original timescale for the meeting was meant to be earlier in the summer, but my then opposite number became
not so opposite.
First of all, he was unwell, and then he was invisible, and no one's seen him. I mean, no one's seen him since the summer, so that kind of delayed things. And then we drifted into multilateral season. You got UNGA, you got NATO foreign ministers, G7 foreign ministers. So there was a bit of a window, and so I would prefer to have a short trip than no trip.
How much were you brought in on that delay when Qin Gang first started? Well, I think it was a EU meeting that he first cancelled on in July. Were the Chinese telling you that he was just ill for a little bit?
Yeah, so look, the public explanation echoed what we were hearing directly, which was, they were still very, very much keen for the visit to happen, but unfortunately the foreign minister was temporarily unavailable, and then that temporary became slightly less temporary, and then he had to stand down from his post, and then Wang Yi was stepped back in as foreign minister. So, their public message was the message that we received, of course, just like their public messaging. I think a lot of people are like, that sounds unusual. It's interestingly, it's not the only time it's happened, obviously, with the defence minister also taking ill, and then
Rocket Force Generals, the CEO of Evergrande this week.
Yeah.
James, slightly different question here. You've been known to sing karaoke with diplomats after some meetings. Anthony Blinken, I think you did a Beatles with.
Yeah. Yes. Oops.
Someone's very excited about Anthony Blinken doing the Beatles.
Yeah. So Tony Blinken, fantastic guitarist, and so was the then foreign minister, Japanese foreign minister Hayashi.
Do you think you could see yourself doing that with the Chinese?
Not just yet. Look, one of the points I made in my Mansion House speech was that I do this job to try and influence other governments.
But they don't open up, do they? Chinese diplomats are famously very disciplined. I mean, I hear what you're saying about the body language that they might be letting off, but they're famously disciplined for staying on message. They don't tend to listen really that much. They certainly don't personally have any lunches or engagements and that kind of stuff. That makes your job as a diplomat very hard to build that rapport, doesn't it?
Yeah, but everyone's human. And look, one of the things that I would say, and I'm very, very conscious that this is on a whole upper level of arrogance, what I'm about to say. But I do always caution people kind of buying into the kind of narrative about how China is and how Chinese officials, because the Chinese government would like nothing more for the whole world to basically say, oh, Chinese diplomats are famously disciplined and give nothing away and that kind of stuff. But you know what? If I use the poker face thing, if you've never played a hand of poker, everybody looks poker faced. But good poker players can spot
the tells,
the really subtle. And I have some fantastic poker players on my payroll. I have people who have engaged with China for decades. I have people in our various posts in China who are on their second, third, fourth tour as diplomats in China, speak Chinese like native speakers, and track longitudinally,
changes.
Those subtle changes, because nobody has a perfect poker face. And that's why having a diplomatic network matters. That's why having experts in the language, culture, and society in China matters, because that's how you tell the difference. If all you do is read the official statement of the meeting, it looks repetitive. But as I say, when you're in the room, and I've noticed it, the first conversation I had with Wang Yi in the margins of the UN General Assembly in September of last year. If you look at the readout of the conversation, my words to him, his words to me, and then the readout of the conversation that we had nearly a year later, you would look at that and go, what was the point? Nothing has changed. But it's all the little subtle differences. It's with how much passion he put forward the Chinese position on various things compared with how much time he spent discussing those issues versus other issues.
Can you give us one example of what do you think has changed between September of last year and your conversation with
him? Well,
the
Chinese economic slowdown, the public failure of zero COVID policy.
You think they're more humble?
The Chinese, well, I mean, they'd never say that, but the Chinese people's reaction, when basically the Chinese people turned around to their government and said, no, we've had enough. You must change your position. And then the Chinese government changed its position. Youth unemployment, I think they stopped publishing the figures at 21%. Our estimates is that it's comfortably over 25%. There are probably, and I might trip myself up on the numbers here, there are probably more newly built vacant properties in China than the total number of properties in the UK.
I think it's the total number of people in the UK.
Yeah, yeah. So there are more newly built vacant properties than the population of the UK. Like, that focuses the mind. And when a British foreign secretary basically says, you need to do things differently, otherwise you will see international trade subtly, gently trending away from you, just at a point where to maintain the growth projections that China needs to fund its contract with its own society, it needs nearly double-digit annual growth. And it ain't going to get it unless it does something differently.
Now, the government's current approach, I think it can be summed up as robust pragmatism. Is that fair to say? I mean, it's no longer the golden era. So can I ask you, when it comes to things like investment, Chinese investment, which is one of the purposes of your visit, in what areas are we robust on? What are the red lines for Chinese investment into the UK or trade with the UK? Because to your critics, it doesn't sound like there's much that's that different.
So the trip was not about trade. I know that there's some kind of post-hoc. I mean, it's one of these things where, and again, I think there needs to be a bit of a re-education. Be careful to use the word re-education. I think there needs to be a bit of a reminder of what diplomacy is about. It's not always immediately transactional. And I kept saying to people, they said, "Oh, you're going over to China to talk about trade." I'm like, no, I'm going over to China to talk about a whole load of stuff. And they're like, "Oh, so what are you hoping to achieve? You can I come back with a trade?"
In general, what are the trade investment red lines?
So the trip was not necessarily about trade investment, but I mean, we've set this out, and again, remind my hosts when I was in Beijing of this. I set this out pretty explicitly in the Mansion House speech that I gave around Easter, which is, of course, we will trade with China. Of course, we will have investment from China, but we do so with our eyes wide open, and we, like many other countries around the world, are now putting a greater priority on our security and protections against inappropriate Chinese either diplomatic or industrial behavior. We are prioritizing that above the commercial. So where security considerations and commercial considerations clash, security considerations always win. And so the exact red lines will be dependent on the exact circumstance, but as a policy, a conscious policy decision now, we are prioritizing security.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think it's fair to say that your Mansion House speech and the government's approach to China is quite different to the last Conservative government's approach to China under Liz Truss just a year ago. Did you change your view on China during that time because you were one of Liz Truss's key backers, or did you always disagree with her on China?
So look, even close friends, political allies don't agree on absolutely everything. Now
she put you in charge as Foreign Secretary. You guys must have been relatively aligned.
And she put me in charge as Foreign Secretary when she became Prime Minister, and of course the Foreign Secretary has an input on foreign policy, the primary input on foreign policy, but all big ticket policy is really decided cross government, and the ultimate arbiter is going to be the Prime Minister. And look, I would have made the case that being vocal in our criticism of China, or describing China in a certain way, if that's the decision that she wanted to take as Prime Minister, I respect that. But that we also had to make sure that we were taking practical measures. And so sometimes when people say, "Oh, our position has softened on China," and I said, "Well, give me an example," because actually we have toughened our stance. As I say, we have toughened our stance on investment from China. We have toughened our protections of freedom of speech and freedom of liberty on university campuses, for example. We have taken practical measures to protect ourselves against all forms of foreign interference. So the practical measures we have toughened up. And if people assume that being less confrontational publicly is a softening of the position, they are missing the areas where they should focus on.
I'll give you one example where it does seem like there has been a softening from both Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss's pledges, which is to shut down Confucius Institutes in the UK. Now, there are 30 of these, and earlier this year the government says that it wasn't going to do that anymore.
So that is based on our assessment of risk. We, of course, take as a freedom of speech and people's individual freedoms. I mean, we had an assessment, for example, of the so-called Chinese police stations, both here in Manchester, in London, and elsewhere. We have made it very, very clear to the Chinese government what we regard to be the boundaries of acceptable behaviour of their actions within the UK. And all governments have manifestations in other countries, whether it be embassies, whether it be for us, the British Council or whatever. And actually, protecting ourselves can sometimes mean shutting things down, absolutely. But you can also protect yourselves without having to shut things down. And for example, we need to look at the relative merits of losing, for example, the ability of the British Council to work in China or indeed other countries. The British Council, since its formation, has not just distributed British language learning. Embedded in that are British cultural norms and British philosophy and British thinking, as well as the British language, the English language. And being careful about losing that influence overseas is really, really key, and that's why it's nuanced. And sometimes you make an assessment about the relative merits of doing something, and sometimes the easy headline isn't always the right headline.
Now, in a recent interview, you said that your military background has trained you to make decisions as far ahead as possible. That's a direct quote from you. In that case, I wondered, what's your thinking of what to do if early one morning you're woken up with a phone call, Foreign Secretary, China has invaded Taiwan?
So look, if I get that phone call, of course, we do thinking about this. You will understand that what I am not going to do on your podcast, as much as I respect you, and I would love to. I would love to make sure that you get good listener figures for this particular episode. I am not going to start talking through the contingency planning that we have for a whole range of eventualities. But I would have regarded that as a massive failure of foreign policy, because, and again, I have said this multiple times and directly to the Chinese government. Disruption across the Taiwan Strait is everybody's business. And inevitably the Chinese government will say, well, no, this is an entirely domestic matter. We don't mess around in your domestic decision making. But this is an entirely domestic matter. It's nothing to do with you. And I say, no, this is not an entirely domestic matter. Huge international trade volumes go through that body of water. The disruption to the movement of key componentry, key bits of the componentry of modern life go through that stretch of water. It would be a catastrophically bad thing for the global economy, and it would be a catastrophically bad thing for the Chinese economy. It would collapse the Chinese economy. As we're now seeing, the Chinese economy is not all-powerful. Their economic dominance, as I said in my Mansion House speech in Easter, is not inevitable. And conflict across the Taiwan Strait would, I think, collapse the Chinese economy and bring a number of other economies down with it. And so it is not in China's interest for that to happen. And this is about diplomacy. Diplomacy and foreign affairs is not just about reacting to events. It's about steering events. We're not just blown around by the winds of circumstance. We make the weather, and preventing that outcome from happening is an absolute core plank of UK's foreign policy in the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region.
And the final question for me, which is that, Foreign Secretary, you've got a great Instagram game. I really enjoy it. Your colleague Grant Shapps is very prolific on TikTok. Do you think you'll go on TikTok anytime soon?
No.
Anyone have any audience questions? Yeah, I think we only take two. So is there a microphone coming from the back there? Yeah. Yeah, so we've got Latika there, and then, we've got Hillary, sorry, the woman in white here. So.
Thanks so much, Cindy. Secretary of State Latika Burke from the Sydney Morning Herald, great to see you. One of the fashionable words that's become, I guess, the word is, the buzzword now is de-risking.
Yeah.
Is this an approach that the UK is following? And if so, What specific sectors do we see de-risking taking place?
Great. And could we just move the microphone to opposite, and then we can deal with both, and then we'll let you go.
Thank you, Cindy. So I just wanted to see what's the realistic chance to reassume the Sino-UK economic financial dialogue, asking as the UK pension industry has a lot of investments and exposure to Chinese market. You've mentioned that, the economy is not doing great. So do we demand a level of dialogue and transparency from the Chinese market?
Look, thank you on both questions. Yeah, I think it was Ursula von der Leyen who coined the phrase, or coined the word de-risking. And so she was speaking in her capacity pan-EU member states. But I do think in various ways, pretty much all countries are doing some form of de-risking. Now, the exact definition, I mean, she used it, and we now kind of tend to use it as an umbrella term for a whole load of things about domestic protection, some of which I've already discussed. Some of it's about diversification of supply chains. Some of it is about making sure that we don't allow kind of pinch points. And de-risking doesn't just have to happen in a bilateral relationship. So, for example, and I've had this conversation with African leaders, at the moment, critical minerals are buried in the ground in many, many, many parts of the world. But the processing of those critical minerals is disproportionately happening in China, which potentially gives China, creates a pinch point, and pinch points can turn into strangleholds. So I think it's in everybody's interest to actually diversify, not necessarily all just where we buy componentry from, but where that processing happens. And I said when I said this to a number of African leaders, Africa has seen its raw commodities exported, whether it's cocoa, whether it's coffee, a whole load of things exported raw, processed and value added outside the continent, and then they've had to buy it back in at a premium, which has had a disastrous long-term effect on African economies. And I said, look, you've had it with cocoa, you've had it with coffee, don't do it with lithium, don't do it with copper, do more processing domestically. Now, there is a massive chunk of self-interest in that because it prevents that pinch point stranglehold risk, but it also helps us stop the boats. Because guess what? If we can lift those African economies, poor Africans are going to be less desirous to try and cross the across the Mediterranean and cross the Channel and come to the UK. So it's a kind of general win-win. So we're all doing it in various forms, and I think it's probably going to be a trend that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. With regard to the dialogue, as I say, we do need to have regular dialogue with China. A lot of UK investment in China, whether it's traditional investment or UK companies having an active economic presence in China, and it matters that we get that right. I think regular dialogue helps. How formalised we make that, we will have to see. That's one of the things that are up for debate. I've said it's in China's interest to get into the habit of being more transparent on some of its economic stuff, on some of its military decision making. Transparency prevents. No, that's not true. Transparency reduces the risks of miscalculations and errors, whether that be in the commercial sphere, diplomatic sphere, or military sphere. So it's in China's interest to be more open. It is not instinctively where they are. But again, you change behaviour by understanding the motivations of your counterparty. And so China recognises it needs to do something different economically. It can't continue doing what it's doing because otherwise it will continue seeing slide. That is an opportunity for influence, and I think it's one that we should take.
Foreign Secretary, thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Sophia and Sam, I thought first of all I could get you guys to reflect on the themes of that discussion. What did you think of what James Cleverly had to say? Sophia, maybe you can start.
I think the Foreign Secretary is obviously treading a similar line to the Mansion House speech, which was extraordinary in its numerous audiences. And I think we're in quite an unusual situation now with foreign policy where we have this foreign policy campaigning infrastructure in Parliament, particularly on the issue of China, which is not something that we historically had before. So it means that the Foreign Secretary is not just having to speak to the Chinese regime, our partners and allies, the British people, British business, but he's also having to speak to Westminster and the different dynamics going on there. And there's obviously an extremely vociferous sort of cell within Westminster who have very strong views about China. So the sort of diplomacy at home is as important as the diplomacy abroad on this issue. I think certainly...
or even inside the Conservative Party alone.
Well, exactly. And, you know, we don't hear a huge amount from Labour on China. We're still waiting to see more of the bones on what they're going to be putting forward. But certainly within the Conservative Party, there has been a ferocious debate. I think it's interesting to hear the Foreign Secretary, and I agree with him, make that point that where a lot of the shifts, the perceived shifts have been, and that softening is really around the public rhetoric. And I think there is a credible argument to say that if you are softening some of that rhetoric, which, by the way, is something that we're seeing, you know, in Canberra, in DC, you know, amongst many of our partners and allies, that actually also allows you to have some kind of greater room for that really, really fundamental security project, which is what we need to do, because everything is about swinging that pendulum and making sure that we have the right balance from which we can actually engage. We want to be engaging from a confident position with all those security measures in place, but we won't be able to engage if we're just sort of, you know, if we've got things too heavily stacked on one side rather than the other. So, and we hear a bit of that in what he's saying about Confucius Institutes, you know. The cost assessment there is to say that the value of the British Council being able to operate is more significant to us and our interests, and I should say our allied interests as well, that's not just about the UK, than closing down these Confucius Institutes, which have been judged to be relatively, you know, not particularly efficacious. So, and I think that is a really interesting balance that they're having to strike there. I mean, I agree with him that you don't want to be fighting the battle in the public rhetoric, you want to be fighting the battle behind the scenes. But of course, because of how sensitive the security dimensions of our relationship with China are, it's often very opaque and it's hard to get officials to speak publicly about all those measures that have been put in place behind the scenes. So I do sort of understand why there is that concern and consternation within Westminster, because there isn't necessarily visibility of everything the government is doing.
I thought it was really interesting what he was saying about the body language of the Chinese, that they're always observing that. You know, as someone who is wanted to be a diplomat once in my life, one time, you know, that kind of colour was really interesting. Sam, what did you make of it?
Well, first of all, let me say that I was twice rejected from the Foreign Office as well. So I share shattered dreams too. I think the view that I have of it is it's good to see the Foreign Secretary talk about these things and add that level of complexity to it. You know, you talk about the body language stuff. I cover how the UK talks about China every single week. I've done for 3 years now. If an MP or a peer has used the word China in Parliament, I have read that word. It's a sad life that I live. And I have to say that the conversation there is on a level that is not often expressed in Westminster. So there's a bit of a vacuum around how do we deal with China in Westminster that's filled by people who have a very strong opinion, which is absolutely fundamental to democracy. But often there's just one set of opinions, one reads in the public domain, in the political domain. It actually surprised me that he was so frank about what he was looking to achieve from those one-on-one meetings with various people. And I wish that there was more of a culture of explaining that, as it were. You know, what's the purpose of what we're doing? I think one of the things the government is particularly poor at is communicating what it's actually trying to achieve. And, you know, all the Foreign Secretary is all fine to report back to his Mansion House speech, but the idea of protect, align, engage, I could have made that up on the spot. It's not going to be something that people understand straight away. So we need more confident messaging about what we're actually trying to achieve here. That would be my hot take.
And Sophia, how do you see the Conservative Party's, you know, we just alluded to it here, own internal conflict on China, something that I think occasionally comes to the fore, but especially over the spy story in the last month or so? You know, where does that go from here? Is that productive in a China discussion?
I think there is a really important conversation to be had around parliamentary education and education more generally in Westminster. I was a little bit disappointed by the response about that Chinese capabilities uplift fund. I mean, to have that as a competitive tender across government just seems insane to me. And I'm also not clear that, you know, there are so many different aspects of our relationship with China that need to come into view. I mean, we've described China as a systemic challenge, but we've actually not implemented a whole of government system level.
Yeah, what does it actually mean?
Shift.
Yeah.
You know, senior officials working in DEFRA, for example, need to have China capabilities because, you know, we need to be understanding our Chinese investors seeking to buy up productive agricultural land. You know, there's so many different things outside of the national security wheelhouse in traditional sense that need to come into view. And I do think as well that just in general, the sort of parliamentary education around China is extremely poor. And there does seem to need to be some kind of process around this. We've lived with the threat of Russia from the sort of Cold War era. Institutionally, we're so comfortable at responding to that and kind of moving the system into gear. And of course, we saw that in the situation with the invasion of Ukraine and that pre-intelligence that we received in anticipation of that, and the system was able to mobilize in response. I still feel that we are really in a reactive phase with China. We are so much better than where we were. But for example, I think a lot of this is about conceptual shifts. We have this conversation about, you know, does China care what Britain thinks or does, or, you know, and all this very British tradition of talking ourselves down about, you know, of course we're just a sort of little minnow and why would China be interested in us? We actually have some really distinct value offer to China, not least of all our position between the two major Western blocs that China is going to be seeking to divide. That's one of its core objectives over the next decade, is to drive a wedge between the EU and the United States and create kind of different spheres of influence there. The UK is uniquely placed within that construction, so even just on that alone. But we do have other sort of value adds, whether that's kind of in diplomacy. I mean, China looks to the UK for climate leadership, sort of policy incubation around this. We are often holding the pen in the international diplomatic community. All of these things have value to China. And we don't seem to be very adept at assessing that value and understanding that we actually will increase and develop and enhance our strategic influence by investing in those areas that are also of value to China. Which is why when we have, you know, questions about rolling back net zero and so on, this is not just a domestic conversation. This is actually about our international influence, and not just with our partners, but also our strategic rivals too.
Now, Sam, in your work looking at what politicians are saying about China, do you feel like, you know, Sophia used the word reactive there? It does sometimes feel like the government is being reactive to concerns that backbenchers bring on China. You know, for example, cases like the British citizen Jimmy Lai, who owned a paper in Hong Kong, really had to see grassroots campaigning for the government to even mention him after the national security law has come into place. You know, James Cleverly sounded very good here, you know, all very smooth. But do you actually think that the government itself has that extensive view of our relationship with China? Sometimes it feels like they're being dragged into positions.
I think that's absolutely fair. I think one of the biggest weaknesses we have in our overall approach to China right now is a government that is constantly or appears to be dragged into acting on various things. I mean, we didn't raise it there cleverly, but one of the things that we could have touched on was the Manchester Consul General incident, where that Hong Konger was beaten. You know, eventually the diplomats left, but it wasn't a case of get out of country. It was more of like a back passage sort of diplomacy thing there. But I think, you know, it's a wider issue, which is that controversially, given that I'm on a panel with a journalist, I do think there is an issue we have in the ecosystem around understanding China, wherein journalists approach MPs for an on or off the record comment on a significant security issue or issue that the MP doesn't know anything about. So let me give you an example, right? Electric vehicles, we're going to have a conversation around where the UK's industrial strategy is on that, what the actual risks are, what the challenges are, what the opportunities are. I do not need to read what an MP thinks about that, fundamentally. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. I need to read what an EV expert or potentially a series of EV experts say about it, and then I can read their insight and compare that to where the government is moving. And at that point, I can see an MP being like, brilliant, I can see the concerns here. So that ties back into your point. And there are exceptions to that rule. There are some MPs who are fantastic at raising things that the government is still incredibly weak on. You know, scan through the parliamentary records of someone like Catherine West, Labour's shadow minister for Asia, and you'll see repeated references to BGI Group, which is a huge Chinese genomics firm. Scan through Alicia Kern stuff, you'll see references to Lodging, which is a Chinese system people use in ports. There are these cases that are brought forward, and the government is really bad at answering, but I do think we need to see more expert comment across the arena, as it were.
And Sam, just on that, you know, Sophia raised the question of what is Labour's position on China? Well, what is Labour's position on China?
Yeah, so I have very little to add beyond what Sophia outlined there. All I would say, the two things that I am speaking to people about when it comes to Labour's position on China, the two things that are stated that are different. The first is that the Labour Party's official position, as of this moment, is that a genocide is taking place in Xinjiang, right? So let's say we sped race through an election and by this time next month, Labour are in power. Labour have an obligation to act if their official view is that a genocide is taking place. They have signed up. We have signed up as a country to the different conventions, etc., etc. That's the one thing. That's a very hefty thing. And the other thing is that Labour have discussed this idea of a UK-China audit. We're going to look at the bilateral. We're going to work out where our risk threshold is, etc., etc. That's the slogan. What lurks beneath that is yet to be seen, but worth keeping an eye on, I think.
And Sophia, rather predictably, he refused to answer my question about Taiwan and what the UK would do. But what do you think that the UK, what do you think would be in British interest to do if China were to invade Taiwan?
Well, there's so many dimensions to this, and I think also we focus very much on the kind of military scenarios there, but there are also a lot of kind of economic statecraft scenarios that need to be mapped as well, and in some ways they may actually be more likely to occur. Look, there was obviously extensive wargaming that went on in Whitehall in the same way it went on in Canberra and DC late last year and early this year. It is something that there is a constant update of scenario planning within HMG. The UK has determined that there is a significant British interest in such a scenario. But of course, I think something that has sort of dawned on the government and many of our allies is that we are living in a very dynamic geopolitical environment that could theoretically give rise to multiple spheres of conflict simultaneously. And of course, in such a scenario, the UK would have to take decisions about its resources alongside our closest allies about whether or not we are needed shoring up the Euro-Atlantic security theatre as well as the Indo-Pacific security theatre. So I think for all these reasons, the shift of emphasis has moved to deterrence, which is where you have projects like AUKUS and so on, which are meant to sort of stave off these kind of eventualities occurring in the first place. But I do think that the UK's consciousness, its sort of awareness, heightened awareness of what's going on in the Indo-Pacific and has dramatically increased, and the sense that we have a direct stake in that, not that that is a higher interest, but that there is a national interest in that, that has been one of the biggest shifts that's taken place over the past year. AUKUS is a response to that, but the development of that thinking and it has been something that has been quite a slow process, but I'd say it's accelerated quite significantly in the past 2 years.
Now, I'd like to move on to some audience questions. So could you raise your hands if does anyone have any questions, just kick us off. Yeah.
James said
oh, sorry, could you just wait for the microphone? Sorry.
James said that you wouldn't try and summarise France in one word, but I think possibly you've got a candidate for China, which is nationalism, which is very extreme, it seems, and I'd be interested in anybody's views on that we have a sufficient appreciation of that, Parliament have a sufficient appreciation of that, and what it leads to, because we know that imperialism in Russia leads to Ukraine.
Interesting. Yeah, should we get to do that question first, and then?
I think that's a really great question. I think it ties into the fact that we have a serious lack of China capability stuff here. I can name honestly on 10 fingers how many people we have in the public political domain talking about China with a proper level of expertise. And what we've seen is that if you don't have the expertise, you can't assess the threat, the challenge, or the opportunity properly. Whether we understand China's nationalism in the media, which often informs the political debate, I would say probably not yet, although Chinese Whispers is doing a great job of getting us there. Good plug. But I do think it's a really critical thing, and it really worries me. I don't have any encouraging words to give you on that, apart from people I speak to are aware that is an issue.
I think you're right that nationalism does define modern China in the sense that communism no longer defines modern China. And it's interesting what manifestation that has on foreign policy, because as you say, imperialism has led to the Ukraine war. Nationalism, of course, could lead to an invasion of Taiwan, but I do think there's a real question of if Xi Jinping is about making China great again, to what extent does invading Taiwan actually make China great again? You know, I know in democratic countries we often talk about a dead cat strategy, distraction strategy from economic problems at home, but actually that particular distraction would make the problems at home so much worse. Almost all of China's maritime trade goes past Taiwan or American military bases in Okinawa in Japan. So, you know, Sophia, as you said, it's these economic statecraft methods that would really screw up China if the West decided to basically besiege China's seas as a response to Taiwan. And I think Beijing knows that. So yes, agreed, nationalism absolutely defines modern China, but I'm not sure it does necessitate an invasion of Taiwan myself. I don't know, Sophia, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, I think I agree with the Foreign Secretary that using one word, I mean, even nationalism, yes, it's an appropriate descriptor, but it's not sufficient because it does not necessarily indicate whether or not that will be accompanied by or would inevitably lead to a form of imperialism that would, you know, have profound geopolitical implications. I mean, I think, you know, it's also the case that there will be nationalist forces affecting a very large number of countries, including many of our allies over the coming decades. So I'm not sure that it's a sufficient term to encapsulate the risk that we're facing here or the nature of it. But yes, I agree it is a huge problem and profoundly disturbing.
We had a question over here as well.
When we talk about relations with China, it seems to be focused on economy, whether they're going to be trading or not. One thing I think we forget to mention is the Chinese people or Taiwanese people. Do they want war? Ordinary Chinese people, Taiwanese people just want to get on with their lives, have the children to go to better schools, better jobs. No one wants war. And I wanted to ask the Foreign Secretary the question in terms of what would be government policy to prevent or help prevent war between these two places. Mm-hmm. Would Chinese people have a role to play? You know, the demonstration to end the zero COVID swiftly within weekend shows that although China may be autocracy, but Chinese people do have a voice. They could influence. Do we have a policy to engage with ordinary people there?
That's really interesting.
Well, the UK has not traditionally been extremely effective at engaging with diaspora communities in the UK or understanding the foreign policy implications for diaspora communities. There are several other countries that do it a lot better than the UK does, frankly. It's sort of interesting to me that in domestic terms, the UK has sort of now is setting up all these different units in the Home Office that's looking at state threats. So these are sort of, this is not the foreign policy people, these are the people who are sort of looking after the home front. So this is a domestic story, and state threats from countries like Iran and China and so on coming from the outside in. And that can involve transnational repression, interference in our democracy, parliament, all of these different areas. But that hasn't really been matched by investments in more positive and constructive engagement with diaspora communities and understanding that that has to be a piece of the puzzle when we are talking about a much more dynamic geopolitical environment. So I think we still have a huge way to go on that, and we have to be aware. I mean, I think obviously the situation with the BNOs in Hong Kong has sort of drawn some attention to that, but again, we're seeing that in sort of reactive kind of enforcement terms rather than thinking about what a proactive and positive engagement story looks like. And I think that also comes into the question about higher education and universities. You know, we need to have some space of allowing a positive cultural influence and exchange to be taking place, where, you know, Western values, culture and society can have positive influence in that respect. And I am concerned that while I think we do need to be a bit cynical and skeptical about our capacity to directly influence in those terms, particularly back in the Chinese domestic environment, we shouldn't be throwing the baby out with the bathwater on that, because there is some work there that does move the dial in small ways. And when we're looking at trying to reduce risks from really catastrophic scenarios, even those tiny little movings of the needle are incredibly important. So I don't actually know what the government's strategy is in terms of trying to engage directly with the Chinese people. It seems quite opaque to me, and I'm not sure it's particularly sophisticated, but it's something that I think needs to be in the mix. And if you look back to, you know, the kinds of things we were doing in the Cold War, you know, this has always been a part of our statecraft. Perhaps we've become a bit more complacent about it.
I'm personally sceptical. I mean, I know the Foreign Secretary said that zero COVID ended because of the protests. I'm personally sceptical of that. I actually think that there were other factors at play where we could already see the Chinese state winding back zero COVID. I don't actually know if we have a good example of popular protests in China leading to political change, as depressing as that is. Having said that, also from a very anecdotal survey of Chinese people that I come in touch with, and my family and friends, the notion that Taiwan is a part of China is a very uncontroversial thing to say in China. It's a really uncontroversial thing to say in China, and I think we have to realize that. It doesn't mean that everyone thinks invasion is a good thing, and I wouldn't be able to say how many people think that there should be an invasion. Probably most people don't think that, but they do think that Taiwan belongs to China. And so I don't know if you would ever get a popular uprising to say, no, don't do that. The only thing I can think of is if, let's say, Beijing makes that step, and it's a really drawn-out, bloody invasion in the way that the Ukraine war has been. There's lots of social media footage, and we know how digital the Chinese are. A lot of social media footage of people who look like them, you know, being killed by the People's Liberation Army. I think that could lead to some kind of popular notion, but I'm sceptical how much the UK could influence that. I do think, though, the UK in its language, you know, doesn't have to be pushing away Chinese people, you know, making very clear and very specific that you're talking about the government and the party, you're not talking about the people and the country and the history and the culture. That's very important to get public opinion on side, is my own view on that. Any other questions? Yeah, one at the back.
Hello. Following on from that, with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the UK government were quick to classify Russia as an enemy, for obvious reasons, being part of NATO. If China did invade Taiwan, morally, should the UK government treat China the same way it did with Russia?
I think it's been made pretty clear to the Chinese regime that the West will respond with some pretty robust sanctions, and you know, and also in defensive military terms. I mean, there are obviously various elements of strategic ambiguity around the defense and military guarantees that will be given, but I think you don't have to be a particularly skilled sleuth to read between the lines. And it's important that the West makes that that credible, because you know, certainly there's been a lot of soul-searching since Russia's invasion of Ukraine about the many opportunities that perhaps there could have been to have enacted a more effective deterrent or a more proactive military response, certainly post-2014. So I think China has learnt from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but so have we. And I think it is... These two security theaters are inextricably linked, And it was something that I think perhaps wasn't on the horizon when Russia crossed that border in February 22, but certainly the Ukraine question and how it pertains to the Taiwan question, they are extremely different scenarios, but I think what would be absolutely consistent is the use of a highly coordinated, robust sanctions regime, which has proven very effective in the Russia case, and I don't think China would be under any illusions that that would be applied.
Sam, what's more, given the parliamentary dynamic we've talked about, presumably the government would have to take very strong steps in reaction to that, not least because of backbench pressure.
Yeah, you would absolutely assume so. And I think to build on Sophia's answer, that it's a really interesting question you can imagine our government asking governments around the world. Because one of the things we saw with the invasion of Ukraine was people saying, every democracy stands against this invasion. And unfortunately, every democracy didn't stand against the invasion. That's not how geopolitics works. It's never that black and white. It's never that simple. And this is where the Australians have absolutely smashed it with the Foreign Minister Penny Wong. You go along to these countries and you say, look, we're in the same neck of the woods. What's your ideal outcome here? What do you want to see this develop like? And how can we help you achieve that? We're X ranking power here, et cetera, et cetera. I think a lot of this stuff can get quite performative, which is fine. Politics is about performing. That's a good thing. But we need to be able to have these conversations. And as both Cindy and Sophia touched on there, it needs to be as a group, as much of a group as we can get together. So it's a really great question. And I hope it's a question that's been asked in embassies around the world right now from the Brits and our close friends too.
And just to round off with my personal thoughts on that question, which is that I think the operative difference is that Ukrainians look like Europeans and the Taiwanese don't. And Taiwan is much, much further from the UK than Ukraine is. So I can totally understand the very immediate and strong reaction that the West and the UK have given. I am interested to see whether that reaction will be similarly reflexive if a Taiwan invasion were to happen. And we already know the pro-Russian, or at least the Russian sympathetic viewpoint on Ukraine already, for example, in America, saying that we shouldn't be helping Ukraine. I can only imagine those voices will be louder if it comes to Taiwan. So I think really interesting question here.